Welcome back. It's a new week of Lent readings for 2021. Today is day 17 and the book we're going to look at is Esther. Now you might remember, if you followed the series, how Israel was divided into two, and then the southern kingdom, which was known then as Judah, was eventually conquered by Babylon, and many of the people were taken to exile. Well, Babylon itself was conquered by Persia, and under a Persian king, Cyrus, many of the people started to come back from exile. The book of Esther is set amongst those people still in exile, and now the king is the son of Cyrus, it's Xerxes. And the story of Esther is unique in books of the Bible in that it doesn't mention the name of God, doesn't mention prayer, it doesn't mention worship, but all through the book is the fingerprints of God, as God's sovereignty is demonstrated, because it's a book about preserving God's people under threat. The story goes like this. King Xerxes is displeased with his queen, and so he's persuaded to find a new one. And so they search the land for the most beautiful women, and that to find a new queen for him. And they find a young girl called Esther, and she becomes his queen. Now Esther is Jewish, but she hides that from them, so they don't know she's from Jewish heritage. Then one day her uncle, Mordecai, hears there's a plot to assassinate the king. He tells Esther, and Esther tells the king, and the plot's thwarted. And because of that, Esther is held in great esteem in the court. A little while later, a man called Haman is promoted in the court. Now Haman's an Agagite. That means he's descended from King Agag, the king of the Amalekites. He's an Amalekite. Now if you read 1 Samuel, was a while ago, we talked about 1 Samuel, when Saul was king, Saul was charged with destroying the Amalekites, because the Amalekites were the first nation to oppose Israel when they left Egypt in the Exodus. And so there it says to destroy the Amalekites. Saul does not do that. He takes some of them captive, he keeps some of the possession. He didn't fulfill what God had asked him to do, and that was the turning point where Saul's downfall and the end of his kingdom. However, now one of those descendants, Haman, makes a plot to destroy the Jews. He persuades the king that it would be a good idea to remove the Jews from the kingdom. Mordecai hears this, tells Esther, and together they make a plan. Esther asks for a feast because she has a special request, and the king grants the feast. There's only 2 guests, the king and Haman. And during the second day of that feast, the king says, "What's your request?" The queen says, "To preserve my life and the life of my people." She points out Haman. Haman is terrified at this. The king storms off, and while there, Haman tries to beg that Esther will have mercy on him. The king comes back, sees them together, and immediately assumes that Haman is trying to seduce the queen. The end result is he's hung on his own gibbet, or some translations say stuck on his own pole that he'd made for the Jews. And the Jewish nation is preserved. Now the bit I want to read is that feast where the queen points out Haman's plan. So I'm going to read that from Esther chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, "What is your petition?" "It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favour with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Who is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, an adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as his words left his mouth, the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching the height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had set it up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. You might wonder why you are where you are at the moment, why you attend certain groups or meetings, why you do a certain role or job. Well, the sovereignty of God means that He's placed you there. The most well-known verse from this whole book, chapter 4, verse 14, when Mordecai is trying to persuade Esther to help save the people, he says that God has placed you there for such a time as this. Wherever we've been placed, we never know how God will use us. It may not be to save a nation, but it may be to influence a situation or help an individual. Till next time, have a blessed day.